Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is NanaEfua, and welcome to this Facebook Live page for Shared Harvest Fund. I am so excited. This is our first live stream, and I hope everyone can hear me. And we're going to take a minute to pause and make sure our technical glitches have been worked out, and also invite other people to the room and to join us. So we just want to take about 2 minutes, maybe. Make sure we can see if anyone has joined us in the comment section. If you joined the room, please go ahead and just give us a shout out. If you're from the East Coast, say hi. From the West Coast, it's 12 o'clock, lunchtime. That's okay. You can eat and watch us. That's not a problem. Say hi there. I think we have some guests from Chicago. We have a couple of viewers from Chicago, and that's pretty exciting. We have so much to talk about today. But before we do, I just want to make sure there's a lot of buzz about what's going on with Shared Harvest Fund. And I am the founder and CEO, and I have two amazing co-founders and a huge team of wonderful people who are just doing some amazing work. The Shared Harvest Fund platform is really designed to bridge two economies, the gig economy and the culture of volunteerism, in a way that will actually help and reduce the student loan debt crisis that we're dealing with. So we'll talk more about what Shared Harvest Fund is all about later, but I have some very exciting news to show you. So as for those of you who don't know, Shared Harvest Fund has been running a Kickstarter campaign for the past 3 weeks. And guess what has happened to our Kickstarter? We've reached goal! Yay! We're very excited to see that. And we're also very excited and thankful for everybody who's been supporting us and continue to support us, because we still have 2 weeks left to raise money, raise funds, and tell people more about what Shared Harvest has to offer to the world. Now, with further ado, let's go ahead and just say hi to all those people who just joined us. Ariana from DC, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Well, I have to introduce our guest speaker today. Her name is Dr. Fenaba Addo. She is amazing. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Consumer Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus. Her research agenda examines how inequalities in debt and wealth creates and recreates family, social, and health inequalities. She's also interested in the role that consumers and family policies serve in reinforcing these relationships and the consequences of economically vulnerable populations in the US, including communities of color, young people, and adults and women. So without further ado, we are going to introduce Dr. Addo. Thank you for being here with us.
Hello.
How are you today?
I'm well. It's such a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So we don't have too much time, but we want to get right into the meat of your wonderful article. Dr. Addo wrote Young, Black, and Still in the Red, Parental Wealth, Race, and Student Loan Debt.
Yes.
Can you tell us, first maybe we can start with the first question, what is intergenerational wealth? And what's the disparity about?
Okay, so I'm gonna step back one step and explain first what exactly is wealth, because I just want to lay the foundation on that, and then we'll get into intergenerational wealth. Okay. So wealth, like income, is a measure of economic well-being. It represents the value of assets owned by households. Net wealth, which is the difference between total assets and total liabilities, or debt, is more commonly used as a relative measure of individual level or group positioning. So wealth, however, represents much more. And this is what we know and are trying to make more known, right? So it can serve as a form of insurance that buffers against negative insurance and household shocks, providing a sense of security and social class insurance. And wealth is important because of what it confers in our society, right? So across social status and, it confers access to social status and political power, capital, selective educational institutions, better health, and healthcare. So when we talk about intergenerational wealth disparities, they exist when wealth disparities from previous or older generations are replicated or persist in younger generations. So one way that this can occur is wealth is passed down intergenerationally, perpetuating these wealth inequalities over time. So, I mean, wealth in the US is highly skewed, right? So most of the population is concentrated at the lower ends of the wealth distribution, and the few at the top have a lot, however, which tends to pull up the mean or average values, which is normally what are reported rather than median values. Mm-hmm. I will also say, and as it pertains to my work, wealth has helped to establish and maintain a system of racial status and hierarchy in America. So lack of wealth, be it through it being withheld or stolen or debt accumulation, have positioned Blacks at the bottom of the wealth distribution across generations, right? So wealth inequality in the US has worsened over time for the entire population, but especially for Black and Latinx populations since the Great Recession, which we can get into a little bit later on. No, and so the work that we're talking about today and how it pertains to some of the work that was published in my publication that you just referenced, in that work, we are kind of asserting that student debt is a new mechanism by which racial, social, and economic inequalities are reproduced across generations.
That's a great start because you're absolutely right. The understanding the historical reference of what wealth means and the value of that is the frame. And it also kind of ties into what we think about what's the value of education, right? And absolutely. The idea, the phenomenon that higher education meant more access. Can you speak to that about how that's being really defined in this era of student loan debt?
Oh my goodness, yes. Okay, so now I can talk a little bit about what's going on in the student debt world. Yes. So in case you haven't been paying attention or haven't been aware, I'm sure the millennials are pretty aware of this, that student loan debt is high and is rising. So according to the Federal Reserve Bank, it's currently about $1.4 trillion, and it has surpassed credit cards and auto loan debt, and it's second to mortgage debt and the household balance sheet. So, high and rising. It even continued to increase throughout the Great Recession, which was between 2007 and 2009, when we saw other forms of consumer debt actually declining. So student debt continued to rise through an economic constriction of credit markets, right? So more students are going to college. So why is this, right? So more students are going to college and are taking on loans to do so. Over the past 30 years or so, college costs have risen faster than inflation, and state and federal aid have failed to keep pace. So what does this mean? This means that students and their families have had to foot an increasing share of the bill, right? Turning to debt to make up the difference between family resources and rising costs, right? Yes. And so people are concerned, right? So clearly Shared Harvest Fund is concerned, policymakers, scholars, stakeholders are all concerned or asking questions about what does this mean for this recent generation of college attending youth. They question whether or not young adults will be able to repay these debts, right? Whether pursuing a college degree and accumulating all this debt is worth the investment or the risk that are involved in doing so, which kind of points to the question that you asked. And will it impact behavior as they age? So will it have lasting impacts on their ability to purchase a home or secure a good job? And actually, some of my earlier research looked at the the association with accumulating student debt and the relationship market. So finding some evidence, especially among young women, that education loan debt was associated with higher or more likely to remain single or transition into a cohabiting union rather than actually marrying. So seeing some real, correlations with later life behaviors and student loan debt accumulation.
I think that's a great point to make because I have a few mentees that I've spoken with who said, one of the biggest deterrent from her finding the right guy in her life is how much debt she's carrying because people are asking the question. So I thought I was, it's a new generation of thought, but it's very important.
It is. And people, I think when I first started doing this research, people were, there's a lot of stigma associated, or there's been research to show there's stigma associated with debt. So questions that I got often were, when is the reveal? When does the reveal happen, right, in a relationship, right? Saying that you alluded to the fact that they're talking about these things. That probably wasn't really the case about 10 years ago in relationships, right? It was kind of like a hush hush, and maybe I'll let them know, but you already kind of, I would say, trap people once you were already dating or so forth before revealing this type of information. But I think because it's become such a salient issue, especially among young adults recently, that they are talking about this and everyone is discussing how much debt they've accumulated. And so many more, the percentage of young adults who are finishing college have debt. It's a reality of their world right now. So
absolutely. So I'd like for you to get into more of the findings of your research. I found quite a few of them very interesting. And
yeah, so I can speak a little bit to the paper that you posted, and then I'll also present some results from some new work that we have been working on since then. It's kind of bridge. So I call this is a 2-part series. First part, the paper that was published is the first part, and then the second part is still in the works. So I'll present some connections. So one of the things that we're looking at, and as I alluded to before, is how or address why we believe that there are racial disparities in debt, and that they're large and might be increasing, over the early adult life course. And second, drawing this connection between disparities in student loan debt and contributing to wealth inequality in young adulthood, and why this matters, right? So tying it to the first paper, one of the specific mechanisms we believe that this debt disparity occurs is through family social background and legacies of disadvantage. So we know that parents' social and economic resources tend to be key determinants for their children's college success, right? So parents use their finances and their knowledge, resources to help their children navigate post-secondary institutions, contribute money to college expenses, and take on debt in lieu of their children. So children who tend to be born to more socially, economically advantaged backgrounds, either by wealth, income, or education, tend to take on less debt than those children from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. One of the things that's important is that family wealth is particularly tend to drive these disparities in debt because federal financial aid decisions aren't predominantly based on wealth, but income, right? And again, alluding to this different in the skewness of the wealth distribution, this is how it tends to play out in the collection of debt disparities through the processes of attending college or attending higher ed, right? So if you can't get access to or have tangible financial assets, then they're less likely to be able to provide that financial support, both in the front and back end of the college process. So attempting to help with those college costs, or upon school leaving, if you have a lot of debt, maybe assisting with helping to pay those debts down. So that was kind of what the first paper first paper showed. And then our second paper is looking at now that we've kind of established that there are these debt disparities, how are they changing over this early, like the 20s, right, in the early 30s, right? And we do find that not only do the Black young adults have more debt, but that the disparity is growing at about 6.6% annually over the period, right? Wow. So Black youth start their young adult careers with more debt than whites, and the disparity grows. Mm-hmm. And we find that in our analysis that the largest mechanism, or the largest explanatory factor for this difference in the debt trajectories are a result of the young adult characteristics, specifically earnings, employment, and educational attainment, right? So we point to, and as I said, this is still work in progress, but we believe that this is an indication that white young adults are either entering employment with better pay or are receiving some financial assistance and are able to start repaying those debts sooner and in larger amounts. So this is something that we can talk about, or I think is important to emphasize that as soon as you finish or you leave school and you have to pay those debts within, I think, 9 months after you graduate or after you leave school.
Some of them, especially with the private loans, they don't have the
grace period, right? Absolutely. Some of them don't even have the grace period. So if you're not paying on those debts immediately upon finishing school, that interest starts to accumulate. And so if you can't start paying down immediately, that is going to accumulate over time. And we do see, and at least in our data, on average, the white young adults are able we see declines in those in the early years upon school leaving, and either stagnation or very little movement among the Black young adults in the sample.
Well, that's a great point.
The inability to pay it right upon school leaving. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that leads us kind of into some of the work that the Shared Harvest Fund is trying to do. We are solution driven in that a lot of times we think about, this astronomical debt. And wouldn't there be a great opportunity to be able to bank it in that credit towards paying off that debt by the time you end up in 4 years? A lot of times people think, oh, this is sweat equity that I'm doing, working, studying for these 4 years. And some people may or may not have a part-time job. The work-study opportunities are much more declined and narrow in scope for people to actually put money into their education while they're going through school. And so Shared Harvest really wants to create a platform that you can bank it in. So the idea is, as a student, you sign up, you continue to work in any area of your interest. And then during the time while you're graduating, by the time you graduate, you banked in almost $20,000. And we'll talk more about that, but that's really the crust of trying to come up with solutions. Do you in your research see any positive outcomes, or are there any other changes that are happening that you've seen in your research?
So I think that this is the problem or the curse of doing research is that we tend to be slow with regards to what is actually happening. There are so many amazing initiatives, including Shared Harvest Fund, that are trying to address this, student loan debt or repayment crisis issue that is happening in our society. And we're just, still collecting data. And I think we need to continue to follow both millennials and even the young adults who are coming even after the millennials. That's how old I'm. There's a new generation of young adults who are now making their way through college and seeing those who are, trying different ways of how to manage paying for college, reducing both, the amount of that they borrow, and then tackling those debts as soon or quickly after finishing college, which seems to be what works best, right? I mean, in a greater or a larger macro sense, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the policy end with regard to reducing college costs and tuition. But I think where we see a lot of the more innovative solutions coming, especially for young adults who are kind of saddled with the debt right now and for whom bankruptcy is not an option, and just not paying on those loans is not an option because it can cause serious credit problems for down the line. What can we do? And I think this is where some of the more innovative work is happening. But the researchers are behind as far as understanding what the many different solutions are, how they're working, and what's going to happen, and what works best, I think.
The research is still important.
Yes. Thank you
so much. Can you tell me a little bit? We're going to jump over to the feel-good part of what we do. We'd like to highlight some of the organizations, like you were saying, that are actually on the ground doing great work. And I think a lot of the consequences of and other graduates and professionals being saddled with debt is the amount of time they actually have to donate or to work or volunteer or even to mentor. But there are still organizations who are doing just that. Is there any that come to mind for you that actually are special and dear to your heart?
Oh my! So I will say that as I've worked in this area, my interests have evolved in trying to address trying to understand where I want to focus my research interest. Right. So I'm not going to name a specific organization per se, but I will say that I have become very passionate about dismantling the connection between debt accumulation and the criminalization and victimization of women of color. So that's something I'm passionate about. And so while I've been focusing my role in my research on student loan disparities and wealth inequality, my research has informed some national initiatives and trainings and technical assistance on the criminalization of women of color, mainly those that impact health outcomes for them and their communities. So even though this is specific to like consumer debt, there's also, debt is far reaching, especially when we look at the whole household and family and thinking about criminal debt as well. And that seems to disproportionately impact communities of color. So it's my intent to continue to bring awareness to these issues, as well as to provide some ongoing research support for community organizations in this arena. So slightly it's related, because when we think about, young adults who are embedded in families, I think this is important to talk about, but it's an important connection to talk about. But, since I study all types of debt, I think it's that's where I'm particularly passionate about right now. But I would love to hear, ways that other organizations are working to specifically target student loan debt.
No, absolutely. And I think one of what we want to do is highlight that there's a lot of online service opportunities, and, what we think about traditionally of ways for students to repay their debt are usually federal service programs or other initiatives such as that, but they're becoming few and far between. What we want to get into is just the people and the organizations right there in the communities that are doing the work, and kind of bridge that so the platform itself actually becomes the service opportunity that you are working towards. And what we want to do in the later episode is probably get more into that and see how people can get involved.
Absolutely. I will say also that a lot of the initiatives that have been proposed, especially those that have come out, that have been, I guess, pushed by the government, they're hard. They have a lot of heavy lifting. And a lot of researchers have pointed out some of the shortcomings of those programs, which have made it a little difficult for people to actually sign in and sign on, and they have to provide proof of income, and just a lot of heavy and high fixed costs, upfront and fixed costs, which I think is why we see more organizations and grassroots efforts to kind of address this very pressing issue and help people out who are struggling, especially. Yeah.
And I think speaking to what you just said is the gig economy itself it's blossomed because of its flexibility and its ability to have someone focus on what they like, what they love doing, and pursue that. And so at the same time, also earn some real income on the side, what we call side hustles, which is a very common theme in this generation. But what we're trying to do with the Shared Harvest Fund is create a meaningful side hustle, a mindful side hustle, which is actually doing work in the areas that you absolutely love and the social causes that you care about, but also being able to get some of that debt relief back. So that's the focus, and also kind of bringing the idea that we have on the federal level, these loan forgiveness opportunities that are much longer in duration, 10 years, 5 years of your life, into a very short, narrow scope that is flexible to you and exactly where you are in your life, whether you're starting your children, starting to build your family, working abroad. The flexibility is important because the work is still necessary. And so we want to be able to meet people where they are.
Absolutely.
So I want to thank you very much. We want to go ahead and take a couple questions that we have from our viewers. So let's see if we can scroll down and see if we have a couple questions here. Question number one to Dr. Addo. How did you decide to go into this field of study?
Oh, wow. So as I said, I've been very much interested in issues of wealth loss. I think that's where it started, and having lack of savings and debt issues for families and and households. And as I was studying in graduate school, anecdotally, conversations with friends and family, student loan debt issues continuously were what was being discussed among my friends, and I just didn't see the work it showing up in the work or the research that scholars were producing or were talking about. So this work is new, honestly, and I think it, especially with the advent of the Great Recession, it shined a light on the fact that people hadn't been doing work in this area and that we didn't have great data in this area. I hope that I think now there's a lack for research in this area, but I definitely am concerned about what it means to be in debt and how that impacts decision making, both in the short and long term for families.
Do you, and I think I agree with you, I think the research is very necessary. Do you feel like there's a lot of support for research like this?
Yeah, so yes, I think it depends, we do live in the United States, so I think it depends on, there are definitely fads where people are interested more so in mortgage debt, depending on what populations you're interested or what age groups you're interested in, and so I think once student loan debt, as I mentioned before, alluded to, like surpass auto loans and credit card debt, then people started to take notice. But for a long time, when you talked about young adults, much of the research was on credit card debt and, poor behavior surrounding, accumulating debt and so forth. So I think we are starting to see a shift because, acquiring student debt has for the longest time been associated with investments in your human capital and investments in yourself. So it was seen as good debt, right? But what if it's tied to poor outcomes or outcomes that were not necessarily intended, and having to shift both social minds and the ways we consider what debt is and how debt is framed, and that it may differ across populations, right? Or we may see this variation on who has debt and who's able to pay it off, and when is it good and when is it bad. Right. I think that's where we see the research right now, and people still trying to grapple with these issues around where a student loan falls.
No, thank you for sharing. I actually have to jump in, and I have another question, burning question that I have. I think when I was reading your article, one thing that really alarmed me was the lack of relationship. We like to think this misnomer that if you come from a well-to-do family, somehow that in and of itself will help you in terms of debt transfer. And wealth transfer. In that when you come from a well-to-do family, you go to college, you get a great degree, somehow your trajectory is much easier. And what your research saw was actually that had nothing to do with it in terms of what family you came from, especially amongst African Americans.
Right. So that's like, what I was just saying, it varies by populations when we start looking at differences by demographics, for example, or socioeconomic status, right? So in the total sample, there is this negative relationship between household wealth and debt accumulation. So the more wealth you have, the less likely you're about, debt you accumulate. For the Black families in our household, we found no association, right? And even a slightly positive association with those from the higher ends of the Black wealth distribution might be taking on more debt, which is concerning. But thinking again about wealth inequality in our society, and the high ends of the Black wealth distribution doesn't take much to be at the high ends of the Black wealth distribution, because wealth is so skewed and Blacks do not have a lot of wealth in our society, right? So in our data, for example, I'll give you some figures. The top wealth quintile was defined as having at least a household wealth of $191,000. And Black families in our sample made up 3.2% of that group. So very small numbers, right? Of people who actually could qualify for that high end. And we saw the way that their wealth portfolios were composed, huge differences in wealth and home equity. So where the wealth is sitting, right? And financial assets. So it may be harder to pull on certain assets or certain liquid assets in order and transfer that to their children, right? So you can't. You want to take another home loan, like a line of credit on your house. These are things that may necessarily not be great things to do at particular points in time. And there's a lot of actually qualitative research that shows that talks about the fragility of the Black middle class, how they tend to view their status as insecure and not very stable. So, and alluding to the fact that they may have some wealth, but it may not always be there, in the long term. And yes, it's just amazing work, kind of pointing to these relationships and why this might be the case. So, every generation having to rebuild the wealth is what it looks like is or it happens, or experiencing some wealth loss and having to recoup that wealth.
And that's a very important to make. Every generation right now across socioeconomics is also dealing with that. And
I mean, the recession hit a lot of households pretty bad, really badly. Yeah. And some were able to recoup and some are not and still are trying to dig themselves back out.
Exactly. So we want to focus on the next phase of this research is about what positive things, outcomes are going to come out of this, because we are not so entrenched with the knowledge to know that something's got to change, right? So, so let's work on making that change happen and happen for a lot of people.
I mean, I'll just say, I think now more than ever, families and students are hyper aware about borrowing and student loan debt and what it means. So if anything, there is an increase in knowledge, right? And
I mean, it starts with that, right? Being well informed to make informed decisions about where you go to school and how much debt you take out and while you're in school, how much of a burden you give to your parents, because it's psychological. It's not just the physical amount of how much you owe, but that bearing the weight of what is owed and this need to perform and get that best job. And it may not be anything you're doing. It's just our economy right now doesn't provide for some of these top-notch jobs for across the sectors. And all sectors are needed to sustain our economy. So yeah, it's a topic, as you can see, we're all passionate about, and we actually really want to make some real strides for our new generation.
I think that's great. And needed.
We have a couple new questions, but we have to wrap up. So I think we're going to take one more. We have one coming from Los Angeles. It says, the question is student loan challenging the notion that higher education is needed to start a career? What do you think about that?
Ooh, that is, first of all, that was a great question. And I think, so what we do know, and when I present this research, is that individuals or young adults who graduate from college, the returns to a college degrees are consistently higher than young adults who do not go to college, right? So as far as you look at income, lifetime income, they tend to consistently have higher wages, right? So that's why we're hesitant to say, you don't want to suggest that maybe not going to college, because we do see that there is a lifetime rewards or returns to getting a college degree, right? So being able to understand whether or not the debt that you're accumulating is going to is worth the investment, or excuse me, the cost of college is worth the lifetime investment, is what economists work on and try to figure out, right? And it still seems to be the case. There is a lot of variation by college or universities that you attend, major choice, the occupations that you go into. And so I think this is where we start to, where the question becomes a little bit more complex, when we start to think about the actual labor market opportunities based on major choice and college. I think the conversation around student loan, rightfully so, has shifted a little bit to talk about, for-profit institutions and the returns to those types of degrees, for example, as well as non-traditional students. So all my research focuses on young adults, right? These are young adults who tend to enter college in their late teens, for the first time. But there's a growing student debt burden among non-traditional, so older adults who are either matriculating for the first time or re-enrolling after having dropped out, and the debt that they're accumulating. So when we start to think about different populations or non-traditional populations, that's where we also may be concerned about the investments in getting an education and the debt associated with that. But based on current research and current data, it still appears that going to college produces a better return than having not going to college and getting the degree and finishing. Make that very clear.
We had a wonderful volunteer with the organization. And, you know, one of her thoughts about how she was going into architecture school. And she said one of the thoughts that she had was she saw the debt rising and rising as she was going matriculating. But she said she'd be damned if she would stop because other people stop and not get a degree after all this debt. And I think the reality is there has been a myth that, you know, there's good debt and bad debt. And the reality is there is no good debt or bad. There's just debt. What you use or what you invest in, whether it's yourself, is a good thing. Investing in your education and investing in the community development of your skills, that is genuinely a great thing to do. And we want to encourage that. And what I'm afraid more of is that the conversation and the discourse around student loan debt has gotten a lot of young people to think, well, it's not worth it, you know, and it is worth it to invest in yourselves, but we have to be strategic on the how we invest in ourselves. And doesn't mean we need to necessarily accrue so much debt in order to do just that. But yes.
And that there are differential, it's also the case that there are risks associated, and those risks might vary across, across socioeconomic and racial lines.
No, absolutely.
In pursuit of that investment in yourself, so.
Right.
Absolutely.
So we are almost out of time. Any last thoughts before we close out?
I think we had a great discussion. The questions were great, and I'm just looking forward to seeing how and following Shared Harvests as they help to reduce student loan debt for passionate, committed young adults.
Thank you so much for being here and being part of the broadcast. I do want to share before we close out. This is an image of the Shared Harvest Fund model. And this is also our Kickstarter page, please. If you haven't already, go to the Kickstarter page and become a backer. The idea of the Shared Harvest Fund is that we're all into this together. We can do it. And we have a platform that can actually serve to help people pay for their student loans by doing work and service in the community. And the Harvest model makes up Debtfreelancers. Yes, who are Debtfreelancers? These are people who have skills and want to serve in communities and work with social causes that they care most about. And then we have the ChangeMakers, which is our nonprofit organizations that are doing some great work. Some of the great ChangeMakers is Kavi in Brooklyn that work with understanding the disease of violence in our communities. And that's just one example, but there's so many other ChangeMakers organizations out there. And then our harvesters, which are small businesses and our corporations who are actually putting their money where their mouth is and supporting students by having benefit packages that have student loan repayment options in them. And they've been providing matching funds to those individuals. And so that is the model that we're thinking of. Everyone is part of the harvest. The harvest is the funds that help to decrease the overall debt. And then each person becomes a valuable player in this movement to really reduce student loan debt. More about Shared Harvest, you can go to our website at www.sharedharvest.com. You can also always send us an email, go to our Kickstarter. We're on until April 15th, and April 15th is very interesting because, of course, it's tax season. So it's a good time to start thinking about where you're putting your money. And other than that, if there's nothing else, we want to say thank you again for all of everyone out there that has been out and listening to us. And we want to say thank you for your time. Enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you soon. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.